Good evening everyone and welcome back to another video. So recently Poland pretty much banned the right to abortion within its borders, right? And while I haven't quite looked into that specific case, which is to say the case of Poland, right? But let's just talk about the right to abortion in general, shall we? So initially, consider the fact that individual consent is just of prime importance in our society and legal system, right? If someone wants to do something to you, right, if they want to make changes to you physically or mentally or both, right, then you have to agree to it, right? If they're doing things to you, right, if they're making changes to you physically, mentally or both without your consent, that is what it means to harm you, right? And if the quality and quantity of the harm is just like very high, right, if they're harming you to a great deal, right, then you have the right to use force to stop them, right? And if the nature of the harm is such that you have to use lethal force to stop that person from harming you, then you absolutely have the right to use lethal force to stop that person, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, consider what happens during pregnancies. Even during normal pregnancies, right, like hormones could rise to about 400 times their base levels, right? Cardiac volume increases by about 40%, blood pressure increases by about 15%, a whole new organ is developed, right? The placenta, the entire circulatory system is rerouted, right, to make blood supply available for the fetus, right? Now, these are just extraordinary changes. But what if the pregnant person doesn't consent to these changes, which is to say that the pregnant person doesn't want the pregnancy? Well, as we just discussed, these are changes, and if the person doesn't consent to them, then the fetus is harming the pregnant person, right? And as such, and given the quality and quantity of these changes, that person has the right to use lethal force to stop the fetus, because that's the only way that the pregnant person could stop the fetus from making these huge changes to their body. And to say that the pregnant person has the right to use lethal force against the fetus to stop the fetus from making these changes is to say that the pregnant person has a justified right to abortion. So that's it, right? Well, I would love to wrap up the video here, but I can already see a few objections flying towards me. So I'll address a few which I expect, right? Okay, let's begin. Okay, expected objection number one, right? Someone might claim that the pregnant person consented to sex and therefore they consented to the pregnancy. Therefore, they don't have the right to use lethal force against the fetus because they consented to the pregnancy. But did they? Consider this. Sex doesn't guarantee pregnancy, right? So pregnancy is not a necessary consequence of having sex, right? Sex only has the risk of pregnancy, right? So by consenting to sex, you don't consent to a pregnancy, right? Like, I'll give you an analogy, right? Like, if you walk into a dark alley, right, there are a whole host of risks that might be involved, right? There is a risk that you might get raped, right? But that doesn't mean that by simply walking into the dark alley, you have somehow consented to any advances made by any stranger or any person you know towards you, right? That simply doesn't follow. There's a risk when you walk into the dark alley that these things might happen, but you don't consent to these things to happen, right? And if in that dark alley someone is violating your liberty, right, violating your bodily autonomy, you have the right to use lethal force against that rapist to stop him or her. Okay, expected objection number two. right? So someone might be tempted to say, well, okay, you've listed all of these changes that a fetus makes to its parent's body, but the fetus doesn't have moral agency, right? The fetus is not doing all of those things because it wants to, right? It doesn't have a choice, right? So how could you hold it morally culpable for things that it doesn't want to do? Well, fair enough, that's a better objection. I'll give that to you, if indeed you came up with that objection, but it's nothing that can't be dealt with, right? So I'll take you back to that analogy of that dark alley, and imagine this time you've walked into that same dark alley, but this time around there is a stranger, and what's different this time is that the stranger is under the severe influence of alcohol. That stranger has absolutely no sense of what they are doing. In that state, if that stranger starts to make sexual advances to you and you do not consent to those sexual advances, but they proceed nonetheless, does that mean that you do not have the right to use force against that stranger to stop the sexual advances that they are making? And in the case that they try to rape you, do you have the right to use lethal force in order to stop the rape? You absolutely do. Absolutely. Right? So very similarly, although awareness and intent, these are relevant factors, right? But these are not factors that are strong enough, right, to overturn your right to self-defense, right? And similarly, although the fetus is making those changes without any awareness of it making those changes, the pregnant person absolutely has the right to use lethal force against the fetus to stop the fetus from making those changes. Okay, expected objection number 3, right? So someone, maybe some of you, might be tempted to say, well, hold on, how are you drawing these analogies? The fetus, whatever it is doing, right, it is doing all of those things for the sake of preservation of its own life. Well, you're drawing an analogy to rape, and whatever the rapist is doing, right, the rapist is doing for temporary pleasure. Don't you see the asymmetry here? And to that, if you raise that objection, I'll say that's a pretty decent objection. But again, nothing that can't be dealt with. And I'll also tell you the reason of me drawing these analogies, right? I'm drawing the analogy to rape for the sake of simplicity of the analogy. But if you must press me on the asymmetry of the analogy, then I could simply switch up the analogy to cover for your objection. So let's do that, right? So let's take a different analogy in the same dark alley. This time you walk into the dark alley, and this time someone attacks you, but not to rape you, right? They attack you, and you learn that they plan to harvest your kidney, and they plan to do it, right, to keep, because someone they know really needs a kidney, or perhaps they really need a kidney, I don't know, right? In that case, do you have the right to use lethal force against the stranger to prevent them from from knocking you unconscious maybe and then harvesting your kidney? Do you have the right to use lethal force against this stranger? Oh, you absolutely do, right? And very similarly, the pregnant person has the right to use lethal force against the fetus in order to prevent the fetus from making those changes to their body, right? So again, the pregnant person absolutely has the right to abortion. Okay, expected objection number 4. So you might be tempted to say that, hold on, the fetus is making all of those changes to your body because it exists, and it exists as a consequence of what you did. It's a consequence of you having sex. Even if it was not your intention, for the sex to lead to pregnancy. The fact of the matter remains that had you not had sex, the fetus wouldn't have existed, and it wouldn't have been making all of these changes to your body that you don't want. Fair enough, decent objection, but nothing that can't be dealt with. So consider a different analogy this time. This time you're in a room with someone you know, and you've given them alcohol, and you've given them some more alcohol, and some more, and some more, until they are under the severe influence of alcohol, right? In this state, right, they proceed to make sexual advances towards you, right? And you don't consent to those sexual advances, right? But they proceed nonetheless. Clearly, when you gave them so much alcohol, this was not the result that you intended, right? This is not your fault. But nonetheless, this scenario that you're in, where they're making sexual advances towards you, is a consequence of what you did, right? Does that mean that you don't have the right to use force to stop that person from making sexual advances towards you? Absolutely not. You absolutely have the right to use force against that person from making sexual advances towards you, right? And if it is the case that the only kind of force that will work is a lethal force, then you absolutely have the right to use lethal force against the rapist to stop the rape, okay? And very similarly, the pregnant person absolutely has the right to use lethal force against the fetus to stop the fetus from making all of those changes to their body, which is to say that they absolutely have the right to abortion. Okay, so I suppose that's a good place to finish the video, right? So in conclusion, yes, abortion kills. It kills the fetus. That is what it means to have an abortion, right? And that's okay. Okay, and anyone to whom it's applicable should have the right to abortion. So that's it. I've been Aditya Prakash, or Soytheist. If you like the video, leave a like. If you dislike the video, leave a dislike. If you absolutely love the video, subscribe to the channel. You can find me on social media here, and I'll see you in the next one.